Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history doesn't just whisper in the dark. Sometimes it steals millions and vanishes without a trace. Tonight, pull up a chair, settle in, and let the silence of the night wash over you. Because we are diving into the true story behind one of the most daring, most legendary, and most blood-soaked heists in American criminal history. Not the Hollywood version. Not the legend told in smoky bars or whispered in prison yards, but the real story. The story of James "Jimmy" Burke, the cold, calculating Irishman who outsmarted the Mafia, outplayed the FBI, and orchestrated the greatest cash robbery the United States had ever seen. The real Jimmy Conway, the mastermind of the Lufthansa heist. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? We love watching this little underworld grow across countries and time zones. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and prepare to slip into the shadows of the American Mafia, where loyalty was currency, silence was survival, and trust could get you killed. This is Outlaw Icons. If you love disappearing into stories like this, hit subscribe and let the next underworld tale find you in the dark. Jimmy Burke was 13 years old the first time he felt truly powerful, standing in a dusty alley in Queens with blood dripping from his knuckles and a smile he didn't understand yet. The boy he had hit lay curled on the ground, gasping, shocked not just because he'd been beaten, but because Jimmy didn't seem angry at all. He was calm, controlled. He wiped the blood from his lip, slow and careful, like someone straightening his tie before entering a church. That was the moment something changed. He realized that pain, when delivered without emotion, was terrifying. He hadn't just won a fight. He had learned something that would shape his entire life. His eyes, even at 13, were too quiet, too still, like he was observing the world and taking notes. And in some way, he always was. But to understand that moment, you have to go back further, to the city streets that swallowed him long before the world knew his name. He was born in New York City in 1931, but he never really felt like he belonged anywhere. His father was unknown. His mother, a frightened Irish immigrant, abandoned him within weeks of his birth. His paperwork said James Burke, but to most people he was just another orphan with no attachments and no real place in the world. The system moved him like a piece of forgotten luggage, from one cold home to another, his possessions fitting into a single torn bag. Some places were quiet, some were cruel, but all of them taught him the same lesson. Nobody protects you. Nobody saves you. And when bad things happen, no one is coming. You either endure or you disappear. The first foster house had 3 other boys, and they used him as a punching bag, laughing because he never cried. He didn't cry because he learned quickly that tears only made them stronger. The second house kept him locked in a basement when they didn't need him. He would stare at the single narrow window, watching the shadows move across the floor until he started giving those shadows names. He studied silence then, like another kid might study math. In silence, he found control. Words were risky. Silence was safe. It wasn't just physical abuse. It was emotional starvation. No hugs, no birthday candles, no warm voice saying his name like it meant something. He became skilled at becoming invisible. When you're invisible, nobody hurts you. When you have no expectations, nobody can disappoint you. Or so he thought. But deep inside him, something was growing, something cold, methodical, waiting to shape itself into something dangerous. On the streets, kids learned things quick. They learned which streets to avoid after dark, which store owners could be trusted, which drunks got violent. Jimmy watched more than he spoke. He noticed the small details most people didn't. How some men were listened to, not because they were loud, but because they never had to raise their voices. How money moved quietly from one pocket to another. How a man with connections didn't need fists to win a fight. He began to understand that silence wasn't just survival. Silence could be power. By the time he was 10, he had been through 6 foster homes. 3 times, he ended up at juvenile detention, not because he was violent, but because he wandered too far, ran from one house to another, searching for a place that didn't exist. In one detention center in upstate New York, a guard once told him, "Kid, you got eyes like a ghost. You look at people like you ain't really here." Jimmy didn't reply, but inside he thought, maybe I'm not. He was 12 when he realized something important, that the world wasn't fair and never would be. But there was another truth too. Unfair didn't mean unpredictable. People followed patterns, even when they thought they were spontaneous. Men wanted respect, women wanted safety, children wanted protection, and everyone wanted money. Jimmy saw that clearly. It was like looking at a clock and knowing exactly what time it would be in an hour. Life became predictable, and once something is predictable, it can be controlled. Then came the alley incident at 13. He didn't start the fight. He rarely did. But when it started, he didn't hesitate. He remembered every beating, every locked basement, every cold dinner table where he sat alone. But he didn't fight out of rage. He fought with calculation. Each punch was placed like a chess move. When it was over, the older boy lay silent. And Jimmy, for the first time, felt something that wasn't fear or sadness. It was clarity. Violence wasn't meant to intimidate with noise. It was meant to quietly rearrange the world so it suited you. The neighborhood boys started whispering about him. Not loud, not always negative. Some were afraid. Some were impressed. A few wanted to be near him. He didn't seek their company. But he learned something else. Reputation could travel faster than fists. And sometimes it did more damage. One rainy afternoon, he stole a loaf of bread from a bakery in Queens. But it wasn't just for himself. He handed pieces of it to two younger kids shivering near a trash bin. They looked at him like he was either stupid or brave. Maybe he was both. But even then, he knew one of life's simplest truths. People remember kindness just as long as they remember fear. Use both correctly, and you'll never stand alone. He eventually landed in another foster home, run by a woman who smelled of soap and cigarettes. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't warm either. She once asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He looked at her, then looked out the window, and said nothing. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he had too many, and none of them belonged in a conversation like that. He wanted control. He wanted certainty. He wanted to never feel small again. In juvenile detention, he learned about human weakness, not from textbooks, but from watching guards, counselors, older boys. He noticed how fear made people talk too much, how guilt made people look away, how desperate people would trade loyalty for survival. These weren't random observations. They were data points, and Jimmy never forgot them. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the biggest. But he had something most in. He could read people. He could predict them. And he never showed his cards. Every now and then, a social worker would try to talk to him, try to unlock his thoughts. But Jimmy knew the truth. Adults love the idea of saving a troubled kid, but they rarely stuck around long enough to finish what they started. So he stopped hoping, stopped expecting, and instead started observing. By 14, he could sense tension before it formed. He could feel hostility before a punch was thrown. He could tell when someone had something to hide, just by how long they looked at the floor before answering. He didn't just survive the system. He studied it. One evening, as he lay on a stiff cot in juvenile detention, staring at the cracked ceiling, he thought about things differently. He thought not about escaping pain, but about using pain. He thought not about being safe, but about being untouchable. The world wasn't going to fix itself for him, but he could learn to bend it. His life wasn't made of warm memories, but of sharp lessons. And in the cold rhythm of survival, a new version of him began forming. Not a victim, not a fighter, something else, something more dangerous. He would never be loud like other kids. He would never seek attention. Instead, he would become the one who watched, the one who listened, the one who planned. He didn't know it yet, but the blueprint for who he would become, Jimmy Burke, the strategist, the quiet architect of perfect crimes, was already being drawn. One silent observation at a time. But the world was about to change around him. War would reshape America. Streets would become hungrier. Opportunity would start wearing sharper suits. And in the shadows of New York, the Mafia was growing, expanding, waiting for people exactly like him. People who were invisible. People who could think. People built not from comfort, but from survival. And one winter night, as snow softly covered the cracks in the sidewalks of Queens, Jimmy Burke walked past a group of older men playing cards behind a diner alley. He paused, listening to the laughter, the whispers, the clink of coins against wood. They were not foster parents. They were not teachers. They were something else entirely. And they were about to notice him. The boy with the quiet eyes. Chapter 2. The First Score. Rise through reform schools and small-time gangs. 1945 to 1955. The men behind the diner never turned fully toward him, but they paused long enough to let him know he had been seen. In the quiet winters of Queens, attention was currency, and the people who had it rarely gave it by accident. These men weren't parents, and they weren't caretakers. They were something else entirely. Men who understood the street, its rules, and how to bend those rules without ever getting caught. Jimmy didn't approach them. He didn't speak. He watched. He listened. He learned. By the time he turned 14, he had already spent years being shuffled between foster homes and youth detention centers. What he didn't realize then was that while most kids were learning basic lessons from teachers, he had been collecting a different kind of education. How to read human behavior, how to spot fear, how to win trust, and how to calculate risk. These weren't things he was taught. They were things he absorbed. He didn't know when he would use them. He only knew that he would. When he was released back into the city, he wasn't returning to a childhood. That had ended years before. He walked through New York streets like someone decades older. Not confident, but composed. He didn't have friends, but he had familiarity with places where people rarely asked questions. Pool halls, smoky bars, back rooms of convenience stores. These weren't playgrounds, but he navigated them like he had always belonged. Teenagers were rarely welcome in those places. But Jimmy? He was tolerated. Not because of who he was, but because of how he acted. He didn't talk too much. He didn't ask for favors. He watched, always watched, and let silence do most of the talking. At 15, he started running errands for older men. Simple tasks at first, delivering packages, dropping off envelopes, counting numbers in small notebooks that he didn't fully understand yet. They weren't simple favors. They were tests. Reliability was the first currency of trust, and Jimmy proved reliable. Then loyalty. Then silence. Silence, more than anything else. He knew enough not to ask what was inside the packages or why certain names had little check marks beside them in those notebooks. He had no reason to ask. He understood that information in their world wasn't free, it was earned, and he was willing to wait. His whole life had been about waiting. Waiting for the beatings to stop. Waiting for the social worker to leave. Waiting to be moved to a different home. Waiting for a chance. And now that he was surrounded by people who didn't rely on rules or permission, waiting felt less like punishment and more like strategy. He never needed to be the loudest person in the room. In fact, he learned quickly that the loud ones were often the weakest. Real power didn't argue. Real power didn't boast. Real power didn't need to prove anything. Real power just existed. Quietly. Calmly. Just present enough to be felt, but never enough to be threatened. In 1947, the post-war streets of New York were changing. The returning soldiers brought toughness, but they also brought desperation. Work was scarce. Opportunity was scarcer. The black market thrived. Ration goods, alcohol, cigarettes, stolen merchandise. And where there was desperation, there was business. Jimmy saw this before most did. The world didn't run on fairness. It ran on need. And if you could supply that need, even in the shadows, you could survive. You could do more than survive. You could control. He began getting involved in small-time hustles, mostly through older men connected to loosely formed neighborhood street crews. These weren't full-fledged organized crime groups, not yet, but they were networks. Men who stole, traded, sold, and sometimes simply found things that disappeared from trucks, ships, and warehouses. Jimmy wasn't a thief yet. He was an organizer. Someone who kept things in order. Someone who remembered who owed what. Someone who noticed when one man bought something he shouldn't have been able to afford. Someone who remembered faces, movements, behavior patterns. He always noticed when someone got careless. He didn't brag. He didn't show money. He didn't chase girls or cars. He stayed disciplined. Even then, barely 16, he treated life like a long game. Strategy over impulse. Calculation over emotion. And people noticed. Some thought he was too quiet to trust. Others thought he was too cold. But a small few, the ones who mattered, saw something different. They saw potential. He soon met a man connected to the Lucchese family. An older figure who understood Jimmy's silence not as weakness, but as restraint. That man didn't invite Jimmy in. He didn't offer him protection or mentorship. Instead, he watched him work. Watched when he stepped in to de-escalate a fight before it happened. Watched how he could calm angry gamblers simply by walking into the room. Watch how he never lost money, never gambled, but always knew who would. That's when Jimmy learned one of the most valuable lessons of his life. In a world he was entering, information was more powerful than weapons. Guns ended conflicts. Knowledge prevented them. Guns changed outcomes. Knowledge controlled them. He was never fascinated by the violence itself. Violence, to him, was a last resort, a punctuation mark, not a sentence. He started working freight jobs at warehouses and trucking depots, not for the paycheck, but to learn the system. He wanted to understand how goods moved, how cigarettes were counted, how liquor was logged, which drivers ignored weight checks, which clerks took small payments not to ask questions. To most workers, those jobs were boring and repetitive. To Jimmy, they were a map. He was collecting pieces of it, one shift at a time. By 18, his reputation wasn't large, but it was solid. He wasn't just reliable. He was smart. People began to say that he remembered things like a machine. Dates, shipment schedules, drivers, security rotations, inspectors' habits. He never wrote anything down. He didn't have to. He had never needed school. The streets had become his classroom. Human behavior was his textbook. He didn't walk the street like a tough guy. He wasn't interested in intimidation. He walked like someone who already knew the outcome of a situation before it began. By 19, he started moving stolen goods. Not by stealing them, by arranging the deals. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. He learned to set up drop points. He learned how to clean merchandise, how to turn stolen property into unmarked, sellable goods. He rarely touched anything himself. He made connections, took a percentage, kept his mouth shut. It was business. Simple, clean, deliberate. He wasn't a made man and never could be. His Irish blood stopped that path permanently. But that didn't stop him from becoming trusted, respected, essential. What he lacked in heritage, he made up for in value. In organized crime, heritage gave status. Value gave survival. While many young men chased status, Jimmy built value. People began to include him, not socially, not emotionally, but functionally. They included him in conversations about logistics, about routes, about weak security spots at JFK Airport, about truck drivers who didn't ask questions. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a mafia you saw in movies. It was the foundation of organized crime. It was the structure that real power stood on. He was calm, composed, and, most importantly, patient. He could sit through hours of dull observation, watching how guards rotated, when clerks took lunch, which cameras were old, which lights flickered. He studied patterns like a scientist studying organisms. He never counted the money first. He counted the risk. Those who watched him closely began to say he had something rare, a criminal mind that thought like a businessman, not a thug. He didn't get greedy. He didn't get emotional. He just got better. There was no dramatic turning point. No moment where he became a criminal. It was a natural evolution. A slow, deliberate transition from silent observer to quiet strategist. He learned that power wasn't loud. It didn't need to brag. It didn't need to be seen. Real power could sit in silence, unnoticed, while others fought for attention. He didn't belong to the Mafia. Not officially, but quietly, slowly, he began to orbit its edges. By 23, people didn't just know his name. They remembered it. Not because he told them, but because other people had told them, quietly, in rooms where his presence was never announced. but always anticipated. He was still not a made man, but in a world that would soon revolve around money, opportunity, and control, he was becoming something just as dangerous. Chapter 3: The Lucchese Gateway. Meeting Paul Vario and entering organized crime, mid-1950s. By the early 1950s, Jimmy Burke was no longer just an errand runner or a streetwise observer. He was a reliable facilitator in a world where reliability was rare. He had gained attention quietly, without theatrics, through discipline, silence, and calculated observation. That reputation drew him into proximity with real influence. And influence in those neighborhoods often wore tailored suits and kept their voices low. In East New York and Brownsville, men didn't need to introduce themselves. Others did it for them. And one name surfaced more than others: Paul Vario. Paul Vario wasn't a household name to most New Yorkers, but inside mob circles, his reach was unmistakable. He controlled parts of the trucking, construction, and cargo industries operating around John F. Kennedy Airport, then still called Idlewild Airport. He had a reputation for blending criminal operations with legitimate businesses, creating a web of influence that allowed illicit money to move like merchandise, smoothly, invisibly, efficiently. Jimmy understood that kind of architecture. It appealed to him. Not chaos, but structure. Not reckless violence, but strategic manipulation. He recognized in Vario a model of how power could operate quietly, effectively, and without theatrics. People have often misunderstood the early days of Jimmy's crime career, thinking he emerged through flash and fearless recklessness. But his rise was not theatrical. It was procedural. He didn't force himself into Vario's world. He was absorbed into it, piece by piece, through behavior that men like Vario respected. In a world built on uncertainty, Jimmy represented consistency. He never talked too much. He didn't chase status. He delivered results. He followed instructions. And most importantly, he understood the difference between being trusted and being useful. At first, Jimmy wasn't working alongside Vario directly. He was placed where many young associates began, in minor rackets around the airport. He worked small but meaningful jobs, smoothing deals, coordinating delivery routes, managing cut percentages. He walked the border between legal trucking operations and criminal activity, never stepping fully on either side. That balance became the foundation of his career. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an architect of criminal opportunity. He didn't steal freight. He figured out how freight could go missing without being noticed. He wasn't the one loading boxes on trucks. He was the one knowing which trucks to watch, which drivers could be trusted, which supervisors could be paid to look away. Idlewild Airport became Jimmy's classroom. Every truck route, every warehouse number, every shift schedule, every handler rotation was a piece of information with value. He spent hours walking, watching, memorizing. He noticed things others ignored. Which guards smoked, and when. Which loading bays had broken floodlights. Which freight offices were more concerned with paperwork than contents. In his world, a clipboard could be more powerful than a gun. He learned the difference between theft and disappearance. Theft drew investigations. Disappearance inspired confusion. Confusion delayed reaction. Delay created profit. That idea, once established, would eventually evolve into one of the largest cash robberies in American history. But for now, he was still just a student of the system. Vario noticed him, not through introduction, not through recommendation, but through observation. He saw a young Irishman who didn't act like a kid trying to impress wise guys. He saw someone who understood that patience was currency, that precision was a tool, and that silence was a weapon. In the hierarchy of organized crime, heritage mattered. Italians held power, but usefulness could bend rules. Burke would never be a made man, but he could be something more valuable to a business, an essential mechanism within the machine. By 1952, Jimmy was handling larger operations. He began managing loan sharking deals in Brooklyn and Queens. Loan sharking wasn't just lending money. It was controlling people through debt. Once someone owed, they stayed owed. And Jimmy treated those operations with the same precision he used in cargo handling. He didn't threaten borrowers unnecessarily. Intimidation was used only when it served a purpose. Fear wasn't noise. It was leverage. He developed a cold, structured method for handling late payers. He never raised his voice. He never made idle threats. When he spoke, it was short, calm, and final. He understood that violence was not punishment. It was business enforcement. He didn't enjoy it, but he didn't flinch from it either. He approached it clinically, like maintenance on a machine. If a part malfunctioned, it was corrected. And if it couldn't be corrected, it was removed. By the mid-1950s, he was a recognized associate of the Lucchese family, working directly under Paul Vario's crew. His strengths weren't physical intimidation or street charisma. They were calculation, control, and a rare ability to manage logistics, human logistics, money logistics, and merchandise logistics. Vario valued those traits, especially in a time when New York's criminal landscape was evolving. Street-level violence was becoming less important than financial control. Law enforcement was beginning to understand organized crime through paper trails and cargo manifests rather than bar fights and neighborhood shootings. Jimmy adapted early. He didn't see criminal organizations as gangs. He saw them as business networks operating in shadows because the market demanded it. Traditional industries had rules and regulators. His world simply had different ones. Laws, as he saw them, were not moral guidelines. They were regulations that applied to those without alternatives. Organized crime was not chaos. It was parallel order. He established connections with union workers, truckers, forklift operators, airport clerks, and dock supervisors. None of them thought they were working with a major criminal figure. Most thought they were simply involved in occasional favors or arrangement deals. Jimmy never revealed more than necessary. He wasn't a salesman of crime. He was a coordinator of opportunity. He had a theory. People rarely saw themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as problem solvers. If a man needed to pay medical bills and looked the other way while a crate of cigarettes went missing, he wasn't a thief. He was helping his family. If a clerk quietly altered a shipment record in exchange for cash, he wasn't aiding organized crime. He was managing his income. Jimmy understood this deeply. He turned criminal operations into personal rationalizations. That made them sustainable. It wasn't flashy work. It wasn't the kind of crime that made headlines. It was infrastructure. He didn't carry a gun. He carried information. And in that world, information was a weapon. But involvement brought scrutiny. Jimmy was arrested several times in the early 50s. Charges included suspicion of hijacking, fencing stolen property, and extortion. None of the charges stuck. Not because he had powerful legal representation, but because he understood how to remain unconnected. He never signed anything, never handled incriminating evidence personally, never appeared where he didn't need to be. He wasn't invincible, just meticulous. During one interrogation, a detective reportedly told him, "You don't look like a criminal." Jimmy replied, "That's why I'm not in handcuffs." It wasn't arrogance. It was practicality. Over time, his role expanded. He began guiding younger associates, introducing them, not to violence, but to restraint. He showed them where to stand, what to notice, when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. He didn't teach through stories. He taught through example. Discretion, discipline, distance. It was around this period that he developed a personal code. Trust no one fully. Respect those proven valuable, and never act out of emotion. He didn't despise law enforcement. He simply saw them as another variable in the equation of risk. In his view, they weren't enemies. They were conditions. Conditions had to be understood, not fought. By 1955, Jimmy Burke was no longer simply part of the Lucchese network. He was helping to shape it. He wasn't a decision maker. He wasn't a leader. Those roles required heritage, titles, ritual. He didn't need those. He had something different. A skill set that functioned beneath titles, beneath tradition, beneath recognition. He didn't wear rings. He didn't hold ceremonies. But in back rooms of bars, in quiet corners of loading docks, in unmarked offices behind warehouses, people listened when he spoke. He wasn't an underworld prince. nor a feared enforcer. He didn't chase power. He built it, quietly, piece by piece, using patterns, silence, and patience. Not through loyalty, not through allegiance, through value. Chapter 4. Robert's Lounge. Building the Burke crew and expanding his criminal empire. 1960s, 1970s. By the early 1960s, Jimmy Burke was no longer just a trusted associate. He had quietly evolved into a builder of networks. His strengths were rooted in structure, discipline, and loyalty. Not the emotional kind, but a transactional, clear-eyed form of loyalty based on value and mutual reliance. He understood that power was not loud, not theatrical, not always violent. Real power lived in logistics, in who could arrange deliveries, who could find drivers willing to divert trucks, who could pay a supervisor to mark a shipment as delayed instead of stolen. And his reach stretched through Queens, Brooklyn, and specifically into the shadowy spaces around JFK Airport, where millions of dollars in goods flowed in and out of New York every week. It was during this time that Burke established a home base, a quiet, unremarkable location that became the beating heart of his growing operations, Robert's Lounge. Located on Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park, Queens, it appeared to outsiders as nothing more than a local bar. Dimly lit, cigarette smoke hanging in the air, wood-paneled walls, and men drinking quietly at odd hours of the day. But to those who understood its true purpose, it was a nexus. Deals were made there. Plans were drawn there. Disappearances were decided there. It served as Burke's operational headquarters, his recruitment center, his interrogation space, and when necessary, his burial ground. Its basement would become infamous for hosting more than just card games. Robert's Lounge was not chosen randomly. Burke saw it as a strategic location, a neutral space, not too elegant, not too disorderly, where businessmen and criminals could coexist. To most passers-by, it was forgettable, and forgetting made it safe. Inside, Jimmy sat at the same seat most nights, not because he needed to be seen, but because he could observe everyone who walked in or out. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't even Italian. But in that room, his opinion held weight. People didn't wait for him to speak. They watched just to see how he reacted. It was there that Jimmy began fully assembling what became known as the Burke crew, a group of streetwise, ambitious, and profitable associates. They weren't chosen for intimidation or bloodline. They were chosen for skill, dependability, and above all, their ability to earn. Each had a purpose, a role, a specialized function within the expanding framework of Jimmy's organized system. One of the most significant young men who gravitated toward Burke was Henry Hill, a half-Irish, half-Sicilian kid who had long admired the criminal operations on his Brooklyn block. Hill wasn't muscle. He wasn't a strategist, but he understood people. He could talk, charm, negotiate, and move without drawing attention. He wasn't built for violence, but he was built for access. He created connections in places where access was rare, including restaurants, trucking depots, airport offices, and small gambling circuits. Jimmy saw value in that. Henry would later describe Burke as a guy who could plant you in the ground without raising his voice. But that wasn't how Jimmy wanted to be seen. He wanted to be seen as inevitable. Another critical player was Thomas D. Simone, known as Tommy, a volatile and unpredictable young tough from the D. Simone crime family. He was impulsive, prone to unpredictable violent outbursts, but fiercely loyal to Jimmy. Tommy's raw aggression needed direction, and Jimmy provided it, channeling his violence not toward impulse, but toward enforcement. He didn't want Tommy to be feared randomly. He wanted him to be feared on command. There were others, Angelo Sepe, Anthony Stabil, Pernell Stacks Edwards, Louis Caffera, known as Johnny Roast Beef. But what made Burke's crew different was the absence of emotional loyalty. It wasn't about friendship or attachment. It was about function. Everyone had a place. Everyone had a job. Money was made, percentages were calculated, and control was exercised through incentives rather than threats whenever possible. Burke's empire expanded beyond loan sharking and small hijackings. He began coordinating full-scale cargo theft operations out of JFK Airport. The difference between smaller thefts and Burke's approach was precision. He didn't want random truck hijackings. He wanted the schedule, the invoice, the container number, the exact time the driver would look away, and a precise moment when a stolen shipment could re-enter the market clean. New York's major crime families all had interests at the airport, but none were as detail-driven as Burke. He built relationships with truck drivers, shift supervisors, security guards, and warehouse clerks, not through threats, but through quiet arrangements. Some were paid, some were indebted, some were simply ignored by their employers. He turned desperation into access and access into profit. One of his most notable operations during this period was the Air France robbery in 1967. It was not as well known as Lufthansa, but it was a critical rehearsal. Through an inside contact, Burke learned that a large cash shipment, often containing between $150,000 and $200,000, was stored temporarily in the Air France cargo terminal in a poorly secured room. Burke planned the job patiently, studying guard schedules, cleaning staff access, and identifying who had keys to which door. There were no ski masks, no guns, no alarms triggered. One night, Henry Hill and another associate slipped into the building with a copied key and left with nearly $500,000 in untraceable currency. No one was injured. No alarms were triggered. It was clean, calculated, perfectly executed, and it sent a quiet message that the airport was not just vulnerable, it was manageable. Jimmy Burke did not seek glory for that operation. He didn't brag. He didn't celebrate. He reinvested. The money went back into operations, into buying silence, securing new access, establishing deeper connections in the freight industry, and ensuring that future thefts wouldn't just be successful, but sustainable. He operated like a businessman who understood that the real profit was not in one score, but in controlling the flow of information that made those scores possible. He wasn't trying to be the richest. He was trying to be indispensable. Robert's Lounge became more than an informal headquarters. It became a hub for information, opportunity, and management. Not everyone inside was a criminal. Some were simply valuable. Burke created an atmosphere where people could talk, where opportunities were discovered, where risk could be assessed calmly. And, just as importantly, he created an environment where consequences were understood. No one ever raised their voice. But every face in that room registered the same truth. Failure was never an option. Jimmy's reputation for discipline extended to one of his personal philosophies. Do not get directly involved in unpredictable violence. Violence drew police. Violence created attention. Violence disrupted business. But Jimmy was not naive. He understood that in certain cases, violence was the only currency that preserved order. But when he used it, it was never spontaneous. It was instructional. Bodies found in fields, basements, or behind dumpsters were not signs of emotional outburst. They were reminders. Reminders that businesses ran on trust, and trust, in his world, was not just expected but required. In time, associates understood that silence was not just protection, it was policy. Throughout the 1960s and early 70s, Jimmy Burke solidified his role not as a boss, but as an architect, someone who orchestrated criminal networks that functioned without needing his constant presence. He wasn't the one robbing trucks. He was the one arranging who would rob them, when it would happen, who would receive the goods, and how they would be laundered back into circulation. The FBI would later describe him as an organized crime force without a title. He had no official standing in the Italian mob hierarchy, but functionally, he held authority that mattered more than titles. His influence eventually attracted attention from the Lucchese hierarchy. Paul Vario saw him as more than just a valuable associate. He saw him as infrastructure. Jimmy could do what many couldn't. He could generate money reliably, without excessive risk, and without compromising loyalty or hierarchy. He never tried to surpass his place in the system. He didn't chase titles. Titles, to Jimmy, were distractions. Power, as he demonstrated repeatedly, was not about recognition. It was about access, control, certainty, and discipline. Burke's operations expanded into loan sharking, bookmaking, restaurant extortion, and airport manipulation. He didn't diversify because he was ambitious. He diversified because it protected his core operations. If the FBI focused on loan sharking, his freighting deals kept money flowing. If gambling came under scrutiny, stolen goods surfaced through back-channel distribution. None of his business arms were dependent on a single function. Each reinforced the others. By the late 1960s, the Burke crew had become one of the most flexible and profitable criminal networks in New York. They didn't operate under traditional mafia structures. They didn't have rigid ranks or a ceremonial hierarchy. They had roles. They had purpose. They had discipline. And that made them effective. Robert's Lounge never looked significant, but it became a quiet control center where jobs were planned, routes were confirmed, and problems were handled before they ever became reports. Some walked in with money. Some walked in with opportunity. Some never walked out again. Its walls never revealed those secrets, but they held them. Jimmy Burke wasn't a conventional mobster. He wasn't eager for attention, didn't crave status, and didn't view himself as an underworld celebrity. His goal was never dominance. His goal was permanence. And through discipline, structure, and meticulous control, he built something that most criminals never achieved. A system. A system that worked because it didn't rely on one person, one score, or one moment. It worked because every part was designed to survive scrutiny, and the man who designed it never had to raise his voice. Chapter 5. Father, Family Man, and Criminal. The Double Life of Jimmy Burke. Despite his rising influence in the underworld, Jimmy Burke never fit the typical image of a mobster. He didn't dress in flashy suits or throw loud parties. He didn't parade around nightclubs or chase attention. He lived in a modest home in Queens with his wife Mickey, who had known him long before he became a major earner, long before Robert's Lounge became a base of operations. To the outside world, Jimmy was not a feared criminal or an airport hijacking mastermind. He was a family man, a husband, and a father of 3 children, Kathy, Frankie, and Jesse. He kept his 2 worlds strictly separated, never bringing business talk into his home, never discussing crime at the dinner table, and never letting his children see the side of him that others feared. Neighbors described him as polite, soft-spoken, and oddly conservative. He mowed his own lawn. He attended his daughter's school plays. He handed out candy to neighborhood kids on Halloween. But even in those quiet routines, there was discipline. He believed family life needed structure, and he ran his household with the same control he used in his criminal operations. He didn't yell. He didn't punish emotionally, but his expectations were clear. Obedience, respect, discipline, and loyalty were not just suggested. They were required. Unlike many mobsters who hid their outside families from their criminal lives, Jimmy went to great lengths to protect his family from the dangers and temptations of the world he operated in. He never bragged about his earnings. He never introduced his children to high-ranking mobsters. But he did something that few understood. He raised his kids to see loyalty not as a virtue, but as a survival skill. He taught them to keep secrets, not criminal secrets, just personal ones. He taught them that no one needed to know everything, that most problems started with too much talking, that privacy, even within a family, was not dishonesty, it was protection. His wife Mickey understood more than she revealed. She never asked questions, not because she didn't care, but because she understood the danger of knowing too much. She knew that her role was to keep the home stable, predictable, normal. She managed the children, the schooling, the family gatherings, the illusion that everything in their world was ordinary. But she also understood that her husband was not an ordinary man. He had no desire for social life. He rarely attended weddings or family events unless they were strategic. He didn't enjoy celebrations. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. He attended them physically, but mentally, he remained alert, always assessing risk, watching behavior, quietly measuring trustworthiness. Even in his most personal spaces, the instinct for control never fully turned off. The Burke household became known for structure. There was no open chaos, no loud arguments, No fear-driven discipline. Instead, there was order. The children had routines. They had responsibilities. They had very clear limitations about what they could ask and what they should never ask. Jimmy didn't want his children to follow in his footsteps. He didn't see criminal life as glamorous. He saw it as a responsibility, filled with risk, requiring precision, never truly safe. He didn't want his sons to become gangsters. He wanted them to be strong, organized, self-reliant, but outside the life. But one daughter, Kathy, became a different kind of problem. She didn't grow up to be violent or corrupt, but she was drawn to the culture surrounding her father. She enjoyed the weddings with men in expensive coats, the attention of older mob-affiliated kids, the energy of parties where envelopes exchanged hands quietly and gifts arrived in stacks rather than boxes. She was fascinated by the structure and the approval within those circles. Jimmy noticed her interest, not with anger, but with caution. He didn't forbid her involvement. Instead, he quietly managed it. He allowed her to date the sons of associates, people he believed he could control. It wasn't about permission. It was about supervision. When Kathy married the son of an associate from the Gambino-connected circles, the wedding became legendary, not for its extravagance, but for its symbolism. The guest list included Lucchese, Gambino, and Colombo associates, people who rarely mingled casually. A wedding became a business networking event. It was not about celebration. It was about alignment, about displaying trust, about reinforcing alliances. Jimmy paid for the wedding not as a father, but as an investor in visibility. His daughter's wedding became a forum for negotiation, status affirmation, and silent signaling. But while most saw a proud criminal father hosting his daughter's grand wedding, Jimmy saw risk. He monitored every table. He noticed which men avoided eye contact, which conversations lasted too long, which cameras flashed in directions they shouldn't have. There were no police raids, no arrests, no confrontations. But Jimmy saw something else. He saw vulnerability. Most criminals feared the FBI. Jimmy feared disorder. Outside the structured routines of his home, his criminal operations had entered a new era. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Burke expanded into more complex revenue streams, bookmaking, nightclub extortion, and deeper infiltration of airport service chains. But what truly separated him from many wise guys was his refusal to participate in unnecessary flash or display. He never drove expensive cars. He never wore flashy jewelry. He never used drugs, never drank excessively, never gambled. To him, gambling was proof of weakness, an absence of control. He didn't engage in the typical vices of the mob. He only invested in certainty. Many mobsters lived fast and died fast. Many built reputations through outbursts, threats, and unpredictability. Burke built his through discipline and sustainability. He didn't want to dominate. He wanted to endure. But family life and criminal life didn't always remain separate. Jimmy's sons eventually became minor figures in loan sharking and truck theft, not because he wanted them involved, but because he believed the system would swallow them eventually anyway. He couldn't stop their curiosity. So instead, he attempted to control their direction within it. He taught them rules that were never officially written but understood deeply among men in their world. Never follow impulsive criminals. Never allow family tensions to bleed into business. Never act without a plan. Never take a score you cannot control after it's complete. And above all, never talk. He didn't raise them to be criminals. He raised them to survive among criminals. Jimmy's idea of protection was not shelter. It was preparation. But even preparation had limits. His sons, Frankie and Jesse, were not built like him. They didn't have his restraint, his emotional control, or his ability to remain invisible. They sought status, recognition, surface-level approval. They didn't plan with precision. They sought shortcuts. Jimmy saw it early. He once said to an associate, "My kids want what I have, but not what I did to get it." To him, that was the difference between survival and failure in their world. Despite this, Jimmy never let his personal disappointments disrupt the business. He was protective of his family in the ways he understood, removing threats, enforcing boundaries, ensuring silence. But emotionally, he remained distant, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. He knew too many men whose children became liabilities because they were given emotional proximity to operations they didn't understand. The Burke home was quiet, predictable, but never peaceful. To the outside world, it was ordinary. But it was ordinary in the way a locked vault was ordinary. Plain on the outside, tightly controlled on the inside. Jimmy Burke's double life was not about deception. It was about separation. He didn't lie to his children about who he was. He simply never confirmed it. He didn't ask for loyalty from them. He simply expected silence. He once said to a trusted friend, "I don't need my family to understand my world. I need the world to never understand my family." His greatest success was not a robbery, or an extortion ring, or even his control over airport operations. It was that for decades, the FBI, the NYPD, and rival crime families were never able to fully understand how he lived both lives so cleanly. Father and criminal, protector and architect, domestic and dangerous, without ever letting one leak into the other. In a world ruled by unpredictability, Jimmy Burke built something rare. Control. Control of his home. Control of his crew. Control of his empire. Control of his image. Control of his silence. Control of his legacy, long before the world knew his name. Chapter 6. The Truck Hijacking King. The JFK Airport Operations. As Jimmy Burke's influence persisted through the late 1960s and into the early 70s, his focus narrowed toward a single location that defined both his empire and his legacy: John F. Kennedy International Airport. It was not simply an airport to him. It was a vast, complex network of freight, goods, money, schedules, weak oversight, and human vulnerability. To others, it was a transportation hub. To Jimmy, it was an opportunity engine, one that could produce millions of dollars without a single gunshot, if managed precisely. Jimmy was not interested in random heists or chaotic thefts. His obsession lay in predictability. He believed crime, when studied like logistics, could run smoother than any legal enterprise. JFK Airport, shifting thousands of shipments daily, was the perfect laboratory for that theory. Freight arrived from Europe, Asia, and South America, often containing cash transfers, high-value cargo, luxury goods, jewelry, securities, and occasionally, undeclared cash. And because those shipments moved constantly, quietly, and quickly, no single theft, if done correctly, would raise alarms. Cargo theft in New York had existed long before Jimmy, but it was noisy, sloppy, and inefficient. Thieves often waited on highways, hijacked trucks at gunpoint, and dumped their contents into discreet warehouses. Those robberies sparked police responses, insurance claims, and union complaints. Jimmy wanted none of that. He believed hijacking should be invisible, not recognized as theft, but mistaken as misplacement, error, or delayed transit. He began by studying the operations of companies like Air France, Pan Am, Lufthansa, TWA, and Alitalia. He gathered information on freight schedules, clerical documentation patterns, warehouse layouts, and even which supervisors were nearing retirement. He watched which guards were content with their pay, and which ones weren't. He learned that the security of cargo was less determined by locks and guards than by paperwork and complacency. If a shipment's record said it had not arrived, then to the system, it simply had not arrived. Theft did not exist until someone created evidence of it. Jimmy began buying small favors first. Coffee money, a lunch, a bottle. Then, quietly, it became envelopes. If a clerk could adjust a shipping entry at the right time, entire pallets could disappear without anyone even filing a complaint. It was not brute theft. It was supply chain manipulation. The crime was not in taking the merchandise. The crime was in writing that it had never been there. He constructed a system where truck drivers were paid to stall shipments, warehouse employees were paid to misplace items, and clerical staff were paid to alter manifests. The brilliance of Jimmy's system was not in how much was stolen, but in how little was noticed. He did not want headlines. Headlines brought surveillance. He wanted quiet thefts, unreported, undocumented, unnoticed. As his operations expanded, so did his reliance on the Burke crew. Henry Hill handled connections, coordination, and payment distribution. He had a calm presence that Jimmy valued. Tommy DeSimone enforced order when necessary, maintaining strict discipline among associates and ensuring that fear, when needed, traveled efficiently. Other men, such as Angelo Sepe, Louis Caffera, and Johnny Roastbeef, played roles in transportation, laundering, or storage. But unlike many organized crime operations, there was no emotional attachment within this group. There was respect, but no personalization. Business, not ideology, carried the structure. Through the mid-1970s, Burke coordinated increasingly complex cargo diversions. One major operation involved uncut gems transported from South Africa. Another involved mink coats, where hundreds of thousands of dollars in merchandise disappeared during a single rainy evening, logged correctly as delayed arrival. No force, no alarms, just paperwork. The FBI later described Burke's airport operations as the most sophisticated non-corporate supply chain network in the country. He had effectively created an alternate business model within JFK Airport, one built not on brute theft, but on compliance management. He did not fight the system. He quietly replaced parts of it. Burke's strategy extended to how he handled his earnings. Unlike many mobsters who flaunted wealth, Burke reinvested. He purchased loyalty, not jewelry. He paid for silence, not status. His money went into properties, bars, trucks, and financial holdings that could not be traced back easily. He once remarked that any criminal who spent too much time enjoying their money wouldn't have it for long. He believed that restraint, not greed, was the key to long-term success. Despite his careful planning, the operation was not completely invisible. Law enforcement agencies, customs officials, airport police, FBI investigators began noticing an unusual pattern. Reports of missing merchandise were often delayed, vague, or never filed. Insurance companies raised concerns. Loss prevention units across the airport began coordinating with law enforcement. The FBI soon formed a dedicated cargo theft task force. On paper, its mission was to identify rogue truckers and petty thieves. But through months of surveillance, they noticed something deeper. The thefts were not random. They were deliberate, timed, and coordinated. The FBI noticed the quiet regularity of the missing items. That level of consistency was unnatural. It did not suggest luck. It suggested control. And yet, they couldn't prove anything. They knew goods were being stolen, but they could not find where. They knew employees were being bribed, but no one would testify. They knew associates were involved, but they could not link them to the crimes. They had names, Burke, Hill, DeSimone, but no evidence. The operation had no fingerprints, no tapes, no informants. For years, it lived in that impossible space where crime had consequence, but no trace. Burke made sure of that. He never touched stolen goods himself. He never transported the goods. He never appeared near warehouse fencing. He operated strictly through distance, planning, coordinating, advising, but never physically engaging. His definition of safety was physical absence. His theory: if your shoes never touched the crime scene floor, neither could your fingerprints. He was seen by law enforcement, not as a gangster, but as an architect, someone who didn't need violence to secure control. The FBI would later call him the ghost of JFK Airport. Control came at a cost. Burke maintained order through quiet enforcement. He did not tolerate greed, disobedience, or disorder. He enforced discipline quietly, but firmly. A truck driver who made a mistake and drew attention to an operation was not threatened immediately. Instead, he was simply excluded. No more work. No more opportunity. Exile, to Burke, was punishment. Violence was used only when exile failed. But when violence was used, it was absolute. Several men who failed to follow instructions, or who became liabilities due to recklessness, eventually disappeared. Some were rumored to be buried in the basement of Robert's Lounge. Some were found later, in secluded lots across Queens. Others simply never appeared again. Burke did not punish for revenge. He punished for prevention. To him, violence was not emotional. It was procedural. Despite quiet operations and internal discipline, law enforcement tightened its surveillance. The FBI began placing informants. Hidden microphones appeared in bars across Queens. Some of Burke's associates began facing pressure. Informants were rarely made overnight. Instead, pressure built slowly through years of arrests, fines, and threats. Most men cracked not from fear of Burke, but from fear of prison. Jimmy understood that human weakness did not lie in greed alone. It also lay in fear. He believed in controlling both. Throughout the 1970s, Burke's operations remained profitable and largely undetected. But the FBI began recognizing a pattern that stood out among New York's organized crime circles. Burke's thefts, compared to others, were consistently clean. There were no shootouts, no panicked getaways, no ransom calls, no abandoned trucks. The very lack of chaos became suspicious. Authorities began referring to Jimmy not as a hijacker, but as a controller, a man who didn't steal trucks, but stole control of them. In one FBI memo, an investigator wrote, "Burke is not a thief. He is a contractor of theft." His influence extended beyond the Lucchese family. Gambino and Colombo associates occasionally worked through channels. He was still not a made man, and never could be. But hierarchy meant less when profit dictated cooperation. He never overreached. He never took unnecessary risks. But he understood that risk could change shape. In his world, risk wasn't simply about police. It was about human unpredictability, weakness, jealousy, desperation, addiction. He controlled those variables for years. But control, in his world, was never permanent. The airport operations had grown from stolen cigarettes to stolen cargo to stolen cash transfers. The scale of the crimes had evolved. And with evolution came higher stakes, deeper surveillance, and sharper attention. Jimmy Burke still believed that the best theft was one that left no trace. But the world around him was beginning to notice traces. They were faint. They were quiet. But they were there. Chapter 7. The Lufthansa Opportunity, planning the biggest heist in American history. By the late 1970s, Jimmy Burke had built a reputation at John F. Kennedy Airport that few could rival. He wasn't just another criminal figure operating in the shadows. He was a quiet force of organization, control, and precision. His airport operations were not random crimes. They were structured systems. Nothing happened without calculation. No truck was hijacked unless records were manipulated. No shipment disappeared unless its absence could be explained on paper. He didn't crave recognition. He craved efficiency. He didn't seek chaos. He sought control. Yet for all his mastery over logistics and subtle manipulation, one thing had eluded him: scale. His operations had been profitable, yes. Hundreds of thousands here, a few million there. He had pulled off the elegant Air France theft and numerous high-value cargo diversions. But these were still, in his mind, middle-tier operations. His ambitions had evolved. He no longer wanted individual shipments. He no longer wanted stolen coats or misdirected boxes of electronics. He wanted something bigger. Not for ego, not for headlines, but because he understood that within JFK Airport lay a unique vulnerability: money, untraceable and physical, flown in from overseas, temporarily stored, loosely guarded, and moved with minimal documentation. He didn't want traces of wealth. He wanted its entire flow. The opportunity arrived not from surveillance, not from observation, but from inside information, through his associate, bookmaker, and jewelry store owner, Marty Krugman. Krugman was chatty, excitable, and deeply involved in bookmaking circles that extended from the state of New York to Las Vegas. He had a contact, an airport employee named Louis Werner. Werner was heavily in debt from gambling. He owed money to bookmakers connected to Marty. And in that debt lay vulnerability. Werner wasn't a street criminal. He was a cargo agent at Lufthansa's cargo terminal at JFK Airport. He handled documentation, routing, and sometimes security scheduling. He knew when flights were scheduled, when security rotations were thin, and most importantly, when cash arrived. Cash shipments from West Germany flowed regularly into Lufthansa's terminal, often containing between $3 and $5 million in American currency. It came primarily from military personnel, business exchanges, and large overseas transactions. Lufthansa wasn't a bank, but for short periods, it functioned like one. Werner knew that. Werner wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for relief. He told Marty casually that an enormous shipment, rumored to be between $5 and $7 million, would be arriving in December of 1978. He said security was light. He claimed that if someone wanted to take it, it could be done in minutes. Marty relayed the information to Henry Hill, who had become the bridge between loose talk and actionable intelligence. But Henry wasn't in charge of operations. He only knew one person who could turn the information into reality. Burke took interest immediately, not because of excitement, but because the situation met his criteria for control. It wasn't simply a rumor. It had insider validation. It had a time, a place, a known security weakness, and a clean exit route. He didn't want to exploit desperation. He wanted to exploit structure. So he studied. He didn't rush. He observed traffic patterns, guard rotation, delivery van routes, employee parking habits, and radio protocols. He learned which doors required keys, which locks were broken, and which cameras were dummies. He took careful note that the vault was not heavily reinforced and was often left partially open during freight intake periods. He drew no blueprints. He wrote nothing down. Everything was in his head. The plan was not complicated in concept, but it was demanding in precision. He wanted no alarms, no unplanned hostages, no unnecessary violence. He believed a good heist should go unnoticed until the money was already gone. He always said that chaos was evidence. Evidence led to arrest. He began assembling the team. He needed people who could move fast, follow instructions, and most importantly, remain silent afterward. Loyalty was not enough. Reliability was not enough. He needed control. He chose Thomas D. Simone, young, reckless at times, but obedient when guided. He chose Angelo Sepe, calm, quiet, and efficient. He picked Louis Caffra, not for toughness, but for his driving skills. He selected Parnell Stacks Edwards, tasked with disposing of the van and equipment immediately after the heist. Henry Hill provided coordination, connection, and logistical oversight. The rest of the crew would assist, but not lead. None of them knew the full plan. Only Burke did. He tested them. Small jobs, timed rehearsals, verbal drills. He emphasized timing. He emphasized silence. He emphasized discipline. There would be no negotiation during the robbery. No one would speak more than necessary. No improvisation. Jimmy believed that improvisation was how people got arrested. The date was set, the early hours of Monday, December 11th, 1978. At that hour, the airport was busiest with international arrivals, but security was at its weakest. It was dark, cold, near 3 in the morning. The terminal staff would be fatigued. The guards would be on rotation change. Burke didn't go to the airport himself. He stayed at Robert's Lounge, waiting in silence. He did not pace. He did not smoke nervously. He simply waited. At 2:56 in the morning, a van pulled into the Lufthansa cargo terminal. It looked like any other delivery vehicle. No alarms. No dogs. No armed standoff. It rolled quietly onto the tarmac. Inside were 5 men wearing ski masks, carrying only handguns and instructions. They entered through the rear freight door, exactly where Werner said the security was thin. The guard was overwhelmed quickly, not brutally, but efficiently. He wasn't harmed. He was instructed to lie down and keep quiet. He complied. He was more confused than frightened. It didn't feel like a robbery. It felt like control. The crew moved quickly, not frantically. They knew precisely where to go. They didn't wander the halls, searching for loot. They went straight to the vault. The vault wasn't heavily fortified. It didn't need to be. No one believed thieves would try to hit an international cargo bank in the dead of night. They used no explosives. They used no specialized tools. They simply used what they had, keys that had been copied weeks earlier, and men who knew exactly what they were there to do. They opened the vault. Inside were stacks of cash, thick bundles of American bills, wrapped, labeled, and ready for transit. Over $5 million in currency. Nearly $800,000 in jewelry and bonds. The largest single hold of physical money that had ever been inside JFK Airport. It took less than 10 minutes to load the bags into the van. Quiet. Controlled. Undramatic. In total, the heist took no more than 12 minutes. No alarms were triggered. No unnecessary words were spoken. No shots were fired. It was not cinematic. It was methodical. They drove out. Not quickly. Not like fugitives. They left like employees whose shift had just ended. By the time the money was transferred to secured locations arranged by Burke, the sun had not yet risen. By 6 in the morning, Lufthansa officials arrived for business as usual. By 7, a supervisor noticed something unusual. Missing crates, suspicious paperwork, confusion among staff. By 8, the first calls were made. By 9, the FBI office in Manhattan received notification. And by 10, the world knew that someone had just stolen nearly $6 million in cash from an airport. It was the biggest heist in American history. What they didn't know was who. Jimmy Burke stayed silent. He didn't brag. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He didn't gather the crew for a triumphant toast. He treated it as another job, another operation, another calculation. Money had been acquired. Evidence had been minimized. Silence had been enforced. But something had changed. Something subtle. Something intangible. Because while the plan had gone exactly as designed, something new had been introduced. Attention. Chapter 8. December 11th, 1978. The Lufthansa heist execution. When dawn broke over John F. Kennedy International Airport on the morning of December 11th, 1978, operations initially appeared ordinary. Forklifts hummed across the tarmac, cargo clerks clocked in for the morning shift, and trucks lined up to collect loads. To the untrained eye, nothing immediately signaled that millions of dollars had vanished only hours before. But inside the Lufthansa cargo building, there was a growing sense that something had gone wrong. Not something small, something extraordinary, something unreal. The first signs appeared subtly. A clerk noticed that the vault room's exterior door was not latched correctly. A supervisor saw that a guard, who should have been stationed by the freight exit, had not checked in. A custodian remembered seeing a van at an unusual hour on a night that typically saw very few movements. What began as suspicion turned into panic when a staffer unlocked the vault and found nothing inside. Bags, crates, sealed packets containing millions in American currency from European banks, military transfers, and private exchanges, gone. Not scattered, not destroyed, gone. The vault, designed only for short-term holding, didn't have high-level protection. Cash arriving from West Germany was delivered in sealed canvas bags, secured for processing. It was never meant to be stored long-term, and it was never guarded with the intensity of a bank vault. The assumption was that an airport wasn't a target for large-scale cash theft. That assumption collapsed entirely that morning. When the supervisor reported the missing bags, the first reaction was disbelief. Internal checks were made quickly. Paperwork was examined. Loading schedules were reviewed. Vault logs were studied. But even before those checks were complete, a reality settled over the room. This wasn't a clerical mistake. It wasn't a delayed transfer. It wasn't a miscount. It was a robbery. And not just any robbery. This was something different in scale, precision, and planning. By mid-morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was present. Within hours, the number of agents increased. The FBI was already familiar with cargo theft at JFK Airport. In fact, they had been tracking multiple suspicious diversion operations for years. But those cases typically involved stolen appliances, electronics, furs, or small-scale cash pickups. This was different. This was the kind of case that drew headlines, political attention, insurance chaos, and international involvement. And that kind of case brought pressure. Agents immediately began interviewing employees. They expected fear, shock, confusion. What they found instead was an unusual quietness. Employees were careful. They followed protocol. Some were nervous, but none seemed eager to talk. The FBI recognized this behavior. It was the kind of silence not born from ignorance, but from awareness. Many employees didn't know who was responsible. They didn't need to. They knew enough to know that speaking unnecessarily could be dangerous. Law enforcement began piecing together the timeline. Based on logs, camera rotations, and radio reports, investigators estimated that the heist began around 2:56 in the morning and ended before 3:10. In less than 14 minutes, millions of dollars have been taken, without setting off any alarms and without leaving any signs of forced entry. The precision was alarming. The ease was even more unsettling. Investigators knew immediately that this was not the work of amateurs. The heist required detailed knowledge of the building, the vault, the security, and the schedules. It required people who knew which guards worked which shifts, which clerks were most likely to react, which doors were malfunctioning, and which escape routes were least monitored. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of information. Jimmy Burke's involvement was not immediately suspected in official reports. But within the first 48 hours, certain FBI analysts and detectives from the Organized Crime Bureau began looking at names connected to airport crimes. A handful of names kept appearing: Henry Hill, Martin Krugman, Pernell Stacks Edwards, and occasionally, the quiet but powerful figure, Jimmy Burke. The FBI description of him was rarely dramatic. They called him a logistical criminal strategist. Not flashy, not violent, but calculated. They knew he had connections. They suspected he had influence. But now, they believed he had just successfully executed the largest cash robbery in American history. Meanwhile, Burke maintained complete normality. That afternoon, while airports buzzed with panic and law enforcement swarmed cargo terminals, he remained at Robert's Lounge, not celebrating, not reacting, not deviating from routine. He watched horse races on television. He spoke to his associates calmly. He didn't speak about the heist, because according to him, there was nothing to talk about. Business was done. Talking about it had no value. But problems began immediately, not because of law enforcement, but because of unpredictability. Money changes people. For most, stealing money creates risk. But for members of the Burke crew, possessing it created temptation. When the robbery took place, Jimmy believed that discipline would hold. He believed the men would stay calm, quiet, invisible. He believed none would flaunt their earnings. But he underestimated something. Visibility did not always come from confessions. Sometimes it came from behavior. Within a week, 2 of the crew members began purchasing flashy cars. Expensive furs were bought by girlfriends. Jewelry appeared. Parties were thrown. Money, even when stolen perfectly, became dangerous when spent loudly. The FBI noticed. They didn't need declarations or confessions. They just needed signs. And signs were everywhere, except around Jimmy. Jimmy didn't yell. He didn't threaten. But inside Robert's Lounge, his expression began to change. He noticed what the FBI noticed. And he understood what would happen next. He knew that people would talk, not because they wanted to betray him, but because panic would set in. A robbery like Lufthansa didn't just draw FBI attention. It drew Mafia attention. It drew internal questions. Who was involved? Who was responsible? Who got paid? And most importantly, who could talk? Jimmy's strategy was always the same. Control the narrative by removing risk. Risk wasn't abstraction. Risk was people. People who spent excessively. People who talked too much. People with habits. People with fear. Within the crew, there was a subtle shift. Some members began avoiding Robert's Lounge. Others requested meetings in separate locations. Those requests were denied. In Jimmy's world, when someone avoided familiar spaces, they weren't being cautious. They were being unreliable. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure escalated. The FBI set up a permanent investigative base at JFK Airport. A joint task force was formed involving the Port Authority, NYPD, customs, and federal prosecutors. The scale of the crime demanded visibility. The FBI began referring to it not just as a robbery, but as a national security breach. This language wasn't accidental. It was pressure-driven. When millions in untraceable money disappear, accountability is demanded, even if evidence is thin. Agents began trailing known Burke associates. They tailed Tommy. They tailed Stacks. They tailed Henry. They tailed Marty Krugman, whose gambling debts had led to the original tip. They even began watching Robert's lounge, although Jimmy rarely conducted anything incriminating there. What they didn't know was that while they were watching Burke's crew, Burke was watching them. He studied surveillance patterns, car placements, agent rotations, just as he had studied cargo routes and flight schedules years earlier. Surveillance, like crime, had patterns. Burke understood misdirection. He understood patience. He understood removal of vulnerability. The FBI expected confrontation from Burke's world. They didn't understand that Burke's world didn't fight back. It simply removed problems until nothing remained to fight. In the criminal underworld, some people boast about their accomplishments. They glamorize risk. They tell stories. Burke did none of that. He treated the Lufthansa heist just like the Air France job years earlier, as a logistical operation. But this time, there was a fundamental difference. Air France made him money. Lufthansa made him dangerous. Not because law enforcement suspected him, but because law enforcement needed someone to blame. Nothing attracted police attention more than a perfect crime. They couldn't arrest chaos. They needed order. They needed a name. They began to settle on one. Jimmy Burke. The man without a title. The man without a fingerprint. The man without a loose word to his name. But even the most perfect plans have vulnerabilities. For Jimmy, that vulnerability was always the same. It was human. It was never the paperwork. It was never the locks. It was never the warehouse alarms or the security cameras. It was, and always would be, the people. People who took. People who talked. People who panicked. Even when they didn't mean to. Ordinary criminals left evidence. Jimmy Burke left silence. But even silence, in the end, could not prevent what was already set in motion. A robbery that made history. A robbery that demanded answers. A robbery that had one visible flaw. It had succeeded too well. Chapter 9. Paranoia, Cleanup, and the Deadly Aftermath of the Lufthansa Heist. In the days immediately following the Lufthansa Heist, Jimmy Burke remained poised, collected, and seemingly unbothered. He stayed away from the airport, avoided unnecessary movements, and showed no visible signs of anxiety or excitement. To any outside observer, he looked like a man unconnected to anything unusual. But beneath a controlled exterior, his attention had shifted from planning to containment. He did not fear the FBI at that moment. He feared human nature, specifically greed, panic, and the tendency for people to show off when they finally touched real money. Within a week of the robbery, crew members began making mistakes. They didn't speak about the heist, but they acted like they had just come into big money. One bought a brand new Cadillac. Another bought his wife a mink coat. A third began talking loosely in social settings, bragging about big things coming. These were not confessions, but they were signals. Signals that others could parse. Signals that law enforcement could research. Signals that death would soon follow. Burke watched. He didn't react immediately. He didn't yell or threaten. He simply took note. Stacks Edwards was the first real mistake. His job had been the most straightforward: dispose of the van used in the heist. He was told to take it to a junkyard in New Jersey, have it crushed, and make sure nothing remained. Instead, Edwards parked it on a Brooklyn street near his girlfriend's apartment, forgot about it, walked away, and got high. By the time the FBI located it, they had fingerprints, fibers, traces of blood, and potentially usable evidence that tied it to known associates of Burke. Jimmy did not shout. He did not display anger. But those around him noticed he no longer used Stack's name. He simply referred to him as a problem. In Burke's world, a problem was not someone to talk to. It was something to remove. A task, not a discussion. Within days, Stacks Edwards was found dead, shot in the head in a quiet alley in Brooklyn. No struggle. No message. Just a quiet removal of a variable. The FBI now suspected Burke's involvement in the heist. But suspicion was not evidence. So instead of attempting to arrest him, they began watching him. They watched Robert's lounge. They watched his movements. They watched his associates. They waited for someone, anyone, to talk. Jimmy understood. Surveillance did not threaten him. Talking did. He started looking for signs. Who avoided eye contact? Who made excuses? Who showed fear where there should have been composure? Fear, he believed, was more dangerous than betrayal. Fear drove people to make mistakes without intending to. Fear brought detectives to doorsteps. Fear brought informants to witness protection. Fear was something he cannot allow. Marty Krugman, the man who first provided the connection to Lufthansa through bookmaking debts, became increasingly nervous. He was not a hardened criminal. He had a big mouth. He wanted a share. He mentioned it repeatedly. He began calling Henry Hill, reminding him of the tip that made the heist possible. He wanted what he believed he was owed. And then he began something even more dangerous, mentioning that he would go to the authorities if he didn't get paid. Jimmy didn't react emotionally. He simply made a decision. Krugman disappeared. His body was never found. No funeral. No burial. Just removal. The cleanup continued. Angelo Sepe, one of the crew members who had behaved quietly after the heist, noticed that other men were disappearing. He did not panic, but he asked questions. Asking questions was not disloyal, but it was risky. Jimmy noticed. Sepe soon disappeared too. His body surfaced months later in a trunk in Brooklyn. Johnny Roastbeef, real name Louis Caffera, bought a pink Cadillac and gave it to his wife to celebrate. It was flashy, irresponsible, and directly against Burke's code of invisibility. Within weeks, he and his wife were found dead in their car. They had not betrayed anyone. They had simply drawn attention. Henry Hill later said that bodies were being removed not for betrayal, but for optics. Jimmy's strategy was not revenge. It was risk management. He believed that loose behavior created suspicion, not in the criminal world, but in the world of investigators. If suspicion came, arrests would follow. If arrests came, indictments would follow. And if indictments followed, someone eventually would talk. Jimmy did not believe in trust. He believed in control. Control of behavior. Control of information. Control of risk. And when control could not be maintained, he removed the source. His discipline was no longer just logistics. It was elimination. The FBI began noticing a pattern. Associates of the suspected Lufthansa heist were not being arrested. They were being removed. The investigation expanded, not just into theft, but into murder. The heist was no longer just the greatest cash robbery in American history. It had become one of the deadliest. Burke did not stop. His strategy was relentless. Those who were quiet, humble, and disciplined remained untouched. Those who attracted attention were removed. Jimmy believed that if no one talked, no one could prove anything. The FBI could suspect. They could surveil, but they could not confirm. He had always believed that the greatest mistake in criminal enterprise was not theft, but exposure. The successful criminal was not the cleverest thief. He was the quietest one. While bodies disappeared, Jimmy continued conducting business. Loan sharking, gambling operations, and freight theft. He made no major purchases. He did not relocate. He did not attempt to hide. He did not show anxiety or fear. He simply remained calm and uninteresting, a man without erratic behavior. But behind that calmness was a growing awareness. His world had changed. He had executed his perfect plan. The plan had succeeded. But perfection had a price. The larger the crime, the greater the pressure. The greater the pressure, the greater the risk. Law enforcement intensified its efforts. The FBI initiated wiretaps on phones connected to Burke associates. They monitored meetings. They followed cars from Robert's lounge. They began to understand Burke's influence, not because of confessions, but because of patterns. He rarely appeared in group discussions unless something critical was being decided. He never spoke unnecessarily. He avoided phones, paperwork, and most forms of traceable communication. He attended meetings with purpose, then vanished. The FBI could not stop watching him, but they could not prove anything either. Jimmy's world had become a test of endurance. On one side were his calculated methods of silence, discipline, and control. On the other was the persistence of law enforcement, waiting for a single slip, a single moment of weakness, a single confession. Jimmy did not slip, but someone else did. The cleanup reduced risk, but it also reduced stability. Associates grew uneasy. Some began considering their futures. Some realized they might not have one. Some felt that silence guaranteed safety. Others began to feel that silence guaranteed death. Fear could no longer be eliminated one person at a time. It had grown into something else, something Burke could not control. Suspicion. Suspicion didn't talk. Suspicion whispered. It whispered in police stations. It whispered in airports. It whispered in bars. It whispered in Robert's lounge. It whispered a question. Who would disappear next? Jimmy Burke believed he was not fighting law enforcement. He was fighting uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one thing he could not eliminate. In the underworld, cash robbed in minutes could be traced for decades. The Lufthansa money had vanished without a trace. But in that disappearance, suspicion remained. Burke had controlled locks, guards, clerks, and drivers. He had controlled speech, actions, and behavior. He had controlled witnesses, removed liabilities, and executed precision. But control, even executed with absolute discipline, could not erase one reality. When a crime is too perfect, the world doesn't forget it. It keeps looking for someone to blame. Chapter 10. The Disappearance of Tommy DeSimone. Vengeance, Mafia politics, and the cost of control. As the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist unfolded, law enforcement pressure increased, bodies disappeared, and the FBI tightened surveillance. But there was another factor that threatened Jimmy Burke's position, not from outside, but from within. The criminal underworld did not operate solely on money, discipline, or silence. It also operated on unwritten laws, hierarchical structures, obligations, and blood oath systems that were older than any airport scheme or hijacking network. Jimmy had influence. He had power, but he didn't have what made one untouchable in that world: Italian blood. Tommy DeSimone, one of Burke's most feared and loyal associates, had been instrumental in some of Burke's key enforcement operations. Tommy was an enforcer, unpredictable, and dangerously impulsive. He had participated in hijackings, intimidation jobs, and violent cleanups during the post-Lufthansa paranoia. His unpredictability made him useful in some situations, but dangerous in others. He was fiercely loyal to Burke, but loyalty alone couldn't protect someone from the consequences of violating an older and deeper code, one that belonged not to Jimmy Burke, but to the Mafia families that operated around him. Years earlier, Tommy had murdered a Gambino-made man, William "Billy Bats" Benvina, after an argument at Robert's lounge. The killing was not authorized. It was not strategic. It was personal. It was foolish. In the world of organized crime, killing a made man without permission meant only one thing: death, eventually. At the time, the incident had been covered up. The body was buried in farmland. No formal retaliation came, but it was not forgotten. What Burke knew, and what Tommy never fully understood, was that revenge in the Mafia did not operate on urgency. It operated on precision. It waited for opportunity, for political convenience, and above all, for silence. In the years that followed the murder of Billy Bats, the Gambino family did not act immediately. They watched. They waited. They let the infraction ferment until the right moment, until the offending man could be removed cleanly without drawing attention. Tommy believed he was untouchable. He believed that because he was making money, he would be protected. Because he was close to Burke, he assumed he was safe. But in the Mafia, protection came only from formal induction. And because he was not yet a made man, he was not protected. He thought that might change. After the Lufthansa heist, there were conversations, encouragements, subtle suggestions that he might be in line to become officially inducted into the Lucchese family. He believed it. He prepared for it. He looked forward to it. He told Henry Hill on several occasions, "I'm getting my button. They said it's happening soon." He believed that being made meant affirmation, recognition, advancement. He didn't understand that in his case, it meant elimination. When the summons finally came in January of 1979, it was delivered not angrily, not urgently, but calmly. He was told that he was wanted at a private location, supposedly to receive formal induction. He dressed carefully that morning. He was nervous, but excited. He believed he had finally earned status, honor, and respect through loyalty and action. He believed he would finally be recognized as more than an enforcer. He was wrong. He left without telling Burke. He didn't believe he needed to. He believed he was going to be honored, not questioned. He arrived at the location, a modest residential house in Queens, without bodyguards, without suspicion. He walked inside. He never walked out. There was no announcement, no official record, no witnesses willing to speak. No body was ever recovered. In that world, a disappearance sometimes said more than a murder. Disappearance meant judgment had been carried out in silence. Disappearance meant there would be no closure, no message, no investigation. Only acceptance. Burke learned of Tommy's disappearance within days. He was not surprised, nor was he angered. He had understood this outcome long before Tommy had. Burke did not protest the decision. He did not inquire. He simply acknowledged the unwritten rule. He could protect loyalty, but not tradition. In that world, he could orchestrate robberies, move millions, manage networks, but he could not override Mafia law. The Gambinos had waited. They had watched. They had acted when it was clean, quiet, and certain. It was not revenge and anger. It was enforcement. One made man had been killed. One associate was removed. Balance. It was a lesson that shaped the underworld. Money could bend rules. Heritage could not. Burke's power came from discipline, structure, and order. But true protection in that world came only through initiation, bloodline, and ceremony. Burke's associates, no matter how loyal, were always expendable when they crossed those lines. Law enforcement noticed the disappearance. They suspected Burke, but had no evidence. The FBI's organized crime unit knew that Tommy's case was different from previous killings. Tommy had been violent, reckless, and involved in multiple unsolved homicides. But this one didn't seem like ordinary cleanup. It seemed surgical, deliberate, calm. It had the signature not of fear, but of tradition. FBI analysts noted the timing. Tommy had disappeared shortly after the Lufthansa heist and during the cleanup. They believed it had something to do with the robbery. It did not. It had to do with Billy Bats. While the FBI misinterpreted motive, they did understand one thing. The crew was unraveling. Secrecy had given way to suspicion. Control had given way to distrust. Men began watching each other instead of watching the police. Associates moved cautiously. Some disappeared. Some were silenced. Some waited for direction that never came. Burke didn't attempt to refill Tommy's role. He didn't look for another enforcer. He believed that replacing unpredictable force with calculated silence was the better choice. Tommy's absence simplified the structure, even if it emotionally shook the surviving crew. Burke believed that removal, even of loyal associates, was sometimes necessary for order. But it also revealed a deeper truth. Burke's influence had limits. He could orchestrate crime, but he could not protect against blood oath retribution. He could remove risk, but only when that risk belonged to his system. Tommy's risk did not belong to his system anymore. It belonged to the Mafia. Burke remained calm, but something had changed. His world had become quieter, but not safer. He hadn't lost control, but he had been reminded that control existed only within certain boundaries. Law enforcement noticed that Burke did not react emotionally to DeSimone's disappearance. He didn't demand answers. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even attend meetings to discuss it. He acted as though nothing had changed. In law enforcement reports, this behavior was often interpreted as callousness, detachment, or cold-bloodedness. But the truth was simpler. In that world, the disappearance of a man like Tommy was not an unexpected tragedy. It was an expected consequence. Days passed. Weeks passed. No body was found. No official funeral was held. No death certificate was ever issued. No testimony was ever given. The Gambino family never spoke publicly of it. The Lucchese family never acknowledged it. But in the underworld, silence sometimes spoke more loudly than confession. Law enforcement came to understand the message. The Lufthansa heist had revealed the potential of a criminal system built on logistics and silence. The disappearance of Tommy DeSimone revealed its vulnerability to tradition and hierarchy. Jimmy Burke did not speak of Tommy again. He did not reminisce. He did not express regret. He simply adjusted. He continued operating, but with fewer people, tighter discretion, and an even greater emphasis on silence. Control had shifted, not in scale, but in focus. His criminal empire had been built on discipline. But now, discipline had taken a darker form. It was no longer about strategy alone. It was about survival. Not survival from police. Not survival from betrayal. But survival from the rules of an underworld older and deeper than airport theft, older than money, older than strategy. It was the law of the criminal hierarchy. And not even the mastermind of the Lufthansa heist could change that. Chapter 11. Henry Hill, Cocaine, and the Collapse of the Crew, 1979 to 1980. After the disappearance of Tommy DeSimone, something shifted, not in the streets, not in the organizational structure, but in the atmosphere around Jimmy Burke. He did not outwardly react, nor did he publicly alter his operations. But law enforcement pressure continued to build. The FBI was now deeply invested in the Lufthansa investigation, even though they had little physical evidence and no direct witness statements. The Bureau believed the Burke crew was involved, but proving it was a different matter. The crew had remained disciplined, tight, and silent. They were ghosts. But the ghosts were beginning to unravel, not because of loyalty failures, but because of something Burke had always feared beyond police, beyond federal investigation, beyond wiretaps. Unpredictability, human instability. Where Jimmy had relied on structure, patience, and control, others did not share his discipline. Some associates needed reassurance, others needed attention, and some, like Henry Hill, needed stimulation. Drugs, excitement, adrenaline, and the restless chase for the next big thing. Henry, who had once been an invaluable bridge between Burke's logistics and the broader networks of Queens and Brooklyn, was slowly falling into cocaine, paranoia, and instability. Not because of greed, but because of imbalance. The old business model, built on hijacking, gambling, loan sharking, and tightly coordinated theft, was being replaced by something more chaotic: drugs. Drugs did not follow business principles. Drugs created desperation, and desperation attracted law enforcement. Jimmy had always avoided narcotics. He saw drugs as operational hazards. They made people careless. They made them sloppy. They made them prone to talking. Cocaine, in particular, was the enemy of control. It made the quiet loud, the patient impulsive, and the disciplined reckless. He couldn't risk that. So he banned his crew members from dealing drugs or associating with those who did. It wasn't a moral judgment. It was practical. Drugs didn't just attract money. They attracted informants. But Henry Hill began running drug operations anyway. He partnered with a Nassau County distributor named Lenny and began moving significant quantities of cocaine across Queens and Long Island. He believed he could handle it discreetly, that his street contacts would keep it low profile, that no one would notice. He believed he could manage it without drawing attention from Jimmy or from the FBI. He was wrong on all counts. Jimmy was aware of Henry's side activities, but he tolerated them initially, not because he approved, but because he didn't yet see them as a risk. At the time, the FBI was still focused on Lufthansa, and some street-level narcotics movement seemed insignificant compared to an international multi-million-dollar heist. But Henry's drug operation grew. It expanded into distribution. Soon, he was transporting kilos, organizing import streams, and involving people who had nothing to do with Burke's world. He partnered with unstable men, greedy men, drug-driven men, not disciplined earners, not controlled operators, not the type who understood silence. While Burke believed that silence and order preserve criminal longevity, Henry believed that chaos could be managed if you stayed charismatic, persuasive, and lucky. It was a flawed philosophy. Luck was not strategy. And in that world, luck always ran out. In May of 1980, Henry Hill was arrested by Nassau County narcotics detectives. The arrest wasn't glamorous. There were no shootouts, no dramatic getaway attempts. He was simply caught leaving a house full of cocaine. It was routine, but deadly. Not physically, legally. Henry faced 25 years in prison. Not for hijacking, not for extortion, not for Lufthansa, but for cocaine. Jimmy Burke had always feared that the smallest crimes, not the biggest, would destroy them. Lufthansa hadn't brought arrests. Cocaine did. Henry didn't believe he could survive in prison. He didn't fear the law. He feared being silenced. He knew too much, not just about drug trafficking, but about Burke's entire operation, the Lufthansa heist, murder cleanups, and systemic airport corruption. And Henry knew something even more pressing. Jimmy Burke knew that Henry knew too much. From the moment Henry was arrested, he believed Burke would eventually have him killed. Not because Burke disliked him, but because Henry now posed a risk. In Jimmy's world, loyalty was not a sentiment. It was a function. And when function failed, protection ended. The FBI wasted no time. They approached Henry with a proposition. They knew he was now vulnerable. They believed he was fearful. They also believed he was a high-value asset. Informants didn't need to be honest. They just needed to be useful. Henry resisted at first. But when he was released on bail and noticed unmarked cars and suspicious movements around his home, he panicked. He believed Burke had already ordered someone to watch him and eventually kill him. In reality, it was just FBI surveillance. But when fear replaced clarity, Henry made the decision that changed everything. He became a federal witness. He didn't begin with confessions. He began with stories, with names, with silent nods, with timelines, with Lufthansa, with hijacking operations, with Robert's Lounge, with DeSimone, with Krugman, with Burke. He didn't have hard evidence, but he didn't need it. He had context, and context, in the hands of determined prosecutors, could build federal cases. Once Henry began talking, there was no going back. Prosecutors secured witness protection conditions for Henry, his wife, Karen, and their children. They were moved. They were monitored. They were debriefed. They were stripped of their old identity. Henry Hill became the first significant member of Burke's operation to directly provide testimony capable of building a case. Jimmy Burke understood immediately what had happened. Not because anyone told him, but because silence began to change. It was no longer controlled. It was forced. Crew members were being called for questioning. Some cars were being followed. Banking inquiries emerged. Witness identification processes began. Jimmy never showed fear, but he recognized something he had always prepared for. The collapse was not triggered by police, but by the most unpredictable factor: a human decision. In jailhouse conversations, Burke would later say one simple line: "No one beat us. We beat ourselves." It wasn't anger. It wasn't regret. It was observation. At the time, law enforcement still had no physical evidence tying Burke to Lufthansa. But now they had patterns. They had context. They had a narrator. Burke was arrested, not for Lufthansa initially, but for conspiracy, loan sharking, and extortion. They couldn't yet directly prove murder. They couldn't prove the heist, but they could build a case for racketeering. And racketeering didn't require individual crime proof. It only required proof of a consistent pattern of organized criminal activity. The arrests were quiet. Burke did not resist. He did not deny. He did not explain. He simply remained silent, just as he always had. But this time, silence was no longer power. It was defense. FBI investigators would later describe their efforts like this: "We chased him for years, but we didn't catch him. His world did." With Henry Hill speaking and more associates turning state's witness, Burke's entire method of control, restraint, silence, calculation, became overwhelmed by something that couldn't be controlled. Pressure. Pressure that grew beyond the capacity for control. Jimmy Burke never talked. He never admitted anything. He never confessed. But he also never denied. He simply understood. The system he had built, structured, silent, methodical, had not failed because it was flawed. It failed because it depended on people. And in the end, people are not predictable. By 1980, his world had shifted from logistics and hijacking networks to indictments, wiretaps, and trial transcripts. Crime did not catch Jimmy Burke. Survival did. And in his world, survival, when pushed too hard, always led to exposure, not from enemies, but from allies. Chapter 12. The Arrest. Law comes for Jimmy, 1980 to 1982. When law enforcement finally moved decisively against Jimmy Burke, it was not with the dramatic sirens or door-smashing tactics that Hollywood later loved to portray. There were no midnight raids or handcuffs thrown across tables. It was quieter. It was procedural. It was structured, much like Burke's own operations had been. The police did not need to catch him pulling off a heist. They did not need to find him with weapons or marked bills. They simply waited until the evidence, small, almost unremarkable pieces, connected around him like the edges of a tightening web. In 1980, that moment finally arrived. The FBI knew they could not convict him directly for the Lufthansa heist. The money had vanished without a trace. The van had been destroyed. The vault showed no forced entry. There were no fingerprints. There were no cameras that captured anything useful. All they had were suspicions, whispers, and theories. But none of those could survive in court. What they could prove, however, was something far simpler, but just as devastating. Burke's involvement in long-term racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, and illegal control of labor and freight at JFK Airport. They could prove patterns, and patterns were enough under the RICO Act, the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations law that had been designed specifically to bring down structured criminal enterprises. RICO did not require detectives to catch someone committing a single crime. It allowed prosecutors to connect many small crimes, each insignificant on its own, into one broader pattern of organized criminal behavior. In Burke's world, carefully structured, left trails. Not large trails, not obvious trails, but enough to create patterns when placed together. Freight logs, gambling books, loan ledgers, union payout records, bank withdrawals, phone records. Burke had always believed his greatest strength was his invisibility. But invisibility only works when no one connects the dots. The FBI spent 2 years doing nothing but connecting dots. The arrest was carried out in early 1980, without resistance. Burke was taken into custody not for Lufthansa, not for murder, but for something he considered petty compared to the scale of his operations: fixing college basketball games. Point shaving at Boston College, orchestrated by Henry Hill years earlier, now became one of the central cases used to destroy him. It wasn't the crime that mattered. It was the fact that multiple witnesses were willing to testify to the structure around it. Witnesses who explained how bets were placed, how players were bribed, how money was moved, and crucially, who had final approval. The FBI didn't need to prove everything. They only needed to prove that Burke was part of a structured system of organized criminal activity. And they did. Jimmy did not argue. He did not deny. He did not explain. He simply observed, and in doing so, confirmed something quietly. This was not a battle he would win with silence alone. Silence had stopped investigators. Silence had protected him from careless charges. But silence could not protect him from structure. Structure had brought him power. Now it would bring him down. Trials began in 1981. Courtrooms, unlike backroom deals or airport lounges, did not respect silence. They did not fear reputation. They responded only to documentation, witness testimony, and recorded evidence. And for the first time in his life, Jimmy Burke was surrounded not by earners, drivers, or clerks, but by attorneys, federal prosecutors, and former associates ready to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Henry Hill, whose arrest on cocaine charges had triggered the collapse, sat down with FBI agents and federal prosecutors for months, describing Burke's operations in detail. He didn't simply tell stories. He explained structures. He identified patterns. He mapped out how money moved, how trucks were redirected, how clerks were paid, how Robert's lounge functioned quietly as an operations center. He did not have hard evidence for Lufthansa, but his testimony created context. It illustrated how such a heist could have been planned by someone like Burke, not with violence or spectacle, but with discipline, organization, and silence. The prosecution didn't rely on emotional arguments. They relied on consistency. They sought to prove not that Burke was violent or feared, but that he was in control of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Witnesses described how loan payments were collected, how gambling debts were enforced, how stolen cargo was distributed. No single testimony proved leadership. But in total, they painted a picture, not of a loud gangster, but of a quiet architect. On paper, Burke's biggest vulnerability was always distance. He believed that by not touching stolen goods, not appearing at crime scenes, and not making direct threats, he made himself legally untouchable. But in court, that distance was used against him. The prosecution called it management. They called it orchestration. They called it pattern establishment. Under RICO, that made him not safer, but more responsible. In sentencing, the judge described Burke not as an impulsive criminal, but as a controller of criminal enterprise. That meant harsher punishment. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for conspiracy and extortion linked to the Boston College point-shaving operation. It had nothing to do with Lufthansa directly, but the sentence reflected something far bigger. Jimmy Burke was transferred to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, a high-security prison in Pennsylvania. He was in his late 40s. He was not a broken man. He did not panic, but he understood that this was not temporary. He was not waiting for an appeal. He was not preparing for a sentence reduction. He had always known something many criminals ignored. When control is lost, it is rarely recovered. Even inside prison, Burke was composed. He didn't command fear with violence. He commanded respect through discipline, routine, and quiet authority. He never strutted, never bragged, never pretended. Even among inmates, he remained what he always was, unassuming, calm, and calculating. He formed no new alliances. He had no interest in establishing dominance. He had built an empire, but he had no desire to lead in an environment where nothing could be controlled. In 1982, new evidence linked Burke indirectly to an old murder. Richard Eaton, an associate involved in narcotics distribution. Eaton's body had been found in a large refrigerator in Brooklyn years earlier. The body had not triggered an arrest at the time, but now, with multiple witnesses willing to cooperate, including individuals looking for leniency under RICO bargaining, prosecutors built a second case against Burke, this time involving murder conspiracy. Burke did not confess. He did not deny. He did not argue. But in the eyes of the law, this was no longer a man under suspicion. This was a man already convicted of major organized crimes, now tied to further offenses. Prosecutors did not need certainty. They needed probability. And in 1985, probability won. Burke received a second sentence, 25 years to life. Combined with the earlier federal term, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. There were no outbursts, no appeals that mattered, no final speeches. He accepted it the way he had accepted everything else, with silence. Law enforcement had not captured him at a crime scene. They had not seized him with stolen money. They had not produced a single piece of physical evidence linking him to the Lufthansa heist. But they didn't need to. They had proven a simple truth, that a man who built a life on control could not control everything. Not fear, not greed, not human nature, not time. No one ever proved in court that Burke masterminded the Lufthansa heist, but no one ever believed it was anyone else. Chapter 13: Trials, Sentencing, and Life Behind Bars. When Jimmy Burke entered prison under the weight of dual sentences, 20 years for the Boston College point-shaving conspiracy and an additional 25 years to life for murder conspiracy, there was no confusion about what it meant. This was not a temporary setback. This was permanence. He would not be negotiating for reductions. He would not be entertaining the possibility of parole. He was entering a world where control, the one quality that had defined his life, was no longer possible in the way he understood it. Yet even in prison, Burke did not change his demeanor. He did not rage. complain, or rally for influence. He didn't seek to dominate among inmates, nor did he attempt to replicate the structure he had built in Queens and at JFK. He remained who he always had been: quiet, observant, composed, and disciplined. He kept routines. He stayed alert. But he did not attempt to rebuild an empire. This was not his world. He understood that. Before his incarceration, he had operated like an architect, designing systems, managing risk, eliminating threats. But inside, there was nothing to architect. In prison, systems were already designed. Surveillance, hierarchy, order, risk. It was all preset. He didn't need to understand how to manipulate it. He only needed to understand how to exist safely within it. Prison officials described him as polite, cooperative, and low risk. Other inmates respected him, not because of violence, not because of rank, but because he carried himself with an unusual calmness. He did not posture. He did not threaten. He rarely even raised his voice. He was the same man who had once sat in Robert's lounge calculating cargo routes, now walking the yard with his hands behind his back, calculating nothing, accepting everything. What distinguished him from others was his silence. Not silence from fear, silence from certainty, from understanding that in his world, words had never been currency. He did not speak of his past. He did not discuss Lufthansa. He did not talk about murders or airport operations. Even in prison, surrounded by men who knew exactly who he was, Jimmy never acknowledged his crimes. Not because he wanted to play innocent. He simply did not believe in conversation that served no purpose. Henry Hill would later call Burke a man who never confessed to anything, not even to himself. That observation captured something subtle but significant. Burke did not deny his past. He simply did not perform it. He aged quickly in prison, not weakly, but undeniably. His once sharp movement slowed. His legendary discipline, rising early, exercising, maintaining consistent routines, remained intact, but with less vigor. He did not deteriorate mentally, but physically he was no longer the ghost-like figure who moved seamlessly through criminal networks. Prison records show he avoided disciplinary issues. He never joined formal groups, never filed complaints, and never participated in any mediation or behavioral programs. He did not request privileges. He did not petition for counsel or appeal. To correctional officers, he became something rare, a man who understood exactly why he was there and did not fight it. But law enforcement was not finished with him. Even from behind bars, Burke remained a subject of interest. Lufthansa had not been solved. The money had never been recovered. The bodies connected to the cleanup, including Marty Krugman, Angelo Sepe, and Tommy DeSimone, had never been officially linked to the heist. Prosecutors suspected, but could not prove. And Burke, consistent as ever, said nothing. Not in anger, not in denial, just nothing. When the FBI questioned him formally about Lufthansa years into his sentence, he did not refuse to answer. He simply listened, paused, and said, "I don't discuss things that don't matter anymore." It wasn't defiance. It was finality. He did not attempt to rewrite the narrative. He didn't try to protect a criminal legend. Unlike many aging mobsters, he did not glorify his past or exaggerate his influence. He didn't seek admiration. He did not present himself as a retired gangster. He simply let his history remain where it was, in the past, undocumented, incomplete, and unresolved. In prison medical records, he was described as calm and cooperative. He developed arthritis, later hypertension, and gradually endured more serious health complications. He remained mentally sharp, but physically limited. He walked less. He spoke even less. Toward the late 1980s, he began developing intestinal issues. Doctors diagnosed him with stomach cancer. It wasn't immediate, but it was terminal. At first, he resisted needles, treatment, and testing, not because of fear, but because of principle. He did not believe in extending life for the sake of surviving it. In later interviews, former associates described this phase of Burke's life not as tragic, but fitting. He had always believed that control did not mean dominance. It meant restraint. He believed survival was not simply existing, but existing without exposure. In a strange way, prison gave him exactly that. He had become untouchable, not because he was powerful, but because he was finished. In 1989, Burke was transferred to a prison medical facility in Roswell Park, Buffalo, for cancer treatment. Stationary, weak, and confined to a hospital-style bed, he was cared for by correctional medical staff who had no connection to organized crime, no interest in Mafia history, and no emotional investment in the Lufthansa heist. To them, he was not the Irishman, not Jimmy the Gent, not the mastermind of a multi-million-dollar robbery. He was simply inmate number 40137457. Some prison officials attempted to ask questions during treatment, not aggressively, simply out of curiosity or fascination. Some asked what happened to the Lufthansa money. Others asked whether he regretted his choices. One guard reportedly asked him whether he thought Henry Hill had betrayed him. He did not respond, not out of secrecy, but because he did not believe in answering rhetorical questions. Regret was an emotion. Emotion was chaos. Jimmy Burke had never believed in chaos. In his final year, he allowed visitors only from family, rare, brief, and controlled. He spoke very little during these meetings. He did not talk about the past. He did not talk about business. He did not offer apologies or explanations. He simply asked about their well-being, then sat quietly. Kathy, his daughter, visited him shortly before his death. She later said that silence around him was never awkward. It was intentional, she said. He believed that if words didn't serve a purpose, they didn't belong in the room. On April 13, 1996, Jimmy Burke died of cancer at Roswell Park Medical Facility while still under federal custody. He was 64 years old. There were no public statements, no national headlines, no official acknowledgement by the FBI or the Department of Justice describing him as the likely architect of the Lufthansa heist. His crimes had stretched across gambling, hijacking, loan sharking, racketeering, murder conspiracy, extortion, and narcotics-related enforcement. But he was never officially charged with the Lufthansa robbery. He went to his death without confirming, denying, or acknowledging any role in the largest cash robbery in American history. He left behind no memoir, no legal deposition, no detailed interview. He never cooperated, never testified, never clarified. For law enforcement, that was the greatest frustration. For criminal historians, it was the greatest mystery. For Jimmy Burke, it was the only ending that made sense. He had always believed that silence was not the absence of words. Silence was control. And in his final act, silence was all that remained. Chapter 14, Legacy of Silence, Death, Mystique, and the Lufthansa heist legend. By the time Jimmy Burke died in April 1996, much of the world had changed. The Mafia was not the same force it had been during the decades when his influence peaked. Surveillance had evolved, RICO prosecutions had dismantled entire crime families, and the age of quiet, logistical street bosses had largely ended. The world that had once allowed Burke to operate in the shadows, in bars like Robert's Lounge, in forgotten warehouses, in freight offices where paperwork ruled, was slowly disappearing, replaced by digital records, security scanners, and cameras that never blinked. But even as criminal culture shifted, one thing didn't fade: the legend. The Lufthansa heist remained the largest cash robbery ever committed on American soil. Nearly $6 million in untraceable currency vanished in the early hours of December 11, 1978. No marked bills, no fingerprints, no conclusive physical evidence, no camera footage showing the robbers, no bodies left at the scene, no arrests linked directly to the crime. It was, in the eyes of investigators, the perfect robbery. And it remained perfect, even decades later, because it never closed. The money never surfaced. The men behind it were never formally charged, and the one person everyone quietly agreed had orchestrated it never once admitted it. Jimmy Burke was never officially named in any indictment related to Lufthansa. His name was spoken frequently in courtrooms, investigations, testimonies, and FBI documents. But on paper, he was never charged. It was speculation supported by knowledge, testimony supported by context, and belief supported by pattern. But there was one thing missing: evidence. To law enforcement, the case became something more than just an unsolved robbery. It became a symbol of the limits of investigation, of the power of silence, and of the failure of law enforcement to convert suspicion into conviction. The FBI had files, testimonies, time schedules, informant statements, logs, and surveillance notes. They had sketches, warehouse maps, and reconstructed robbery plans. But at the center of it all, there was only silence. Not denial, not lies, just silence. Henry Hill, who became the most public surviving member of the Burke crew after entering witness protection, described Burke not as ruthless, not as brilliant, not as charismatic, but as something much simpler. He called him the most disciplined criminal I ever met. He didn't gamble, didn't brag, didn't drink much, didn't chase spotlight. He thought before he spoke. He never got greedy. Discipline was his real weapon. Not violence, not charisma, not charm, not manipulation. In a world where gangsters talked too much, Jimmy talked too little. In a world where men flashed money, Jimmy hid his. In a world where criminals sought notoriety, Jimmy rejected it. That is why investigators struggled. He did not leave trails because he did not leave ripples. Even in death, he remained unclaimed by the criminal identity others tried to assign to him. The government saw him as a mastermind of the Lufthansa heist. Hollywood portrayed him as Jimmy Conway in the film Goodfellas. Calm, composed, calculating, played by Robert De Niro. Former associates remembered him as cautious, controlled, and unflinching. But Jimmy himself left no narrative. He did not confirm. He did not deny. He did not explain. His sons, Frankie and Jesse, both became involved in crime, including drug trafficking, extortion, and assault, but neither ever possessed their father's restraint. Both were eventually imprisoned, not for their father's legacy, but for their own reckless actions. They lacked his discipline, his distance, and his instinct for invisibility. They had witnessed his world, but had never understood his methods. His daughter Kathy, who once married in a Mafia-connected circles, later said that her father was not what movies made him. She said he was not glamorous, not theatrical, not eager to command. He was not a gangster in the cinematic sense. He was, she said, a businessman who trusted nothing but systems. He had no illusion about loyalty. He didn't trust people. He trusted structure. That distinction mattered. The old Mafia relied on ceremony, lineage, rank, and sworn loyalty. Burke never believed in those things. He believed only in leverage, in patterns, in risk assessment, in removal when necessary. He was not a believer in the honor culture that governed Mafia families. He believed in something colder, cleaner, and more efficient. He believed that criminal longevity came not from fear or respect, but from invisibility. That belief shaped how the Lufthansa heist was executed. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It did not leave bodies on floors or bullets in the air. It was not an act of violence. It was an act of control. Once the bags were taken, the van did not race away dangerously. It rolled out quietly, unobserved, as if it belonged there. There were no disguises, no shootouts, no hostage scenes, just punctuality. Even after the heist, Burke did not gather the crew for celebration. He did not drink or toast a success. He did not congratulate. He simply began watching for errors. In his philosophy, the robbery was not success. Real success would be measured in silence, in invisibility, in absence of consequence. When associates began to fail that test, by showing off their earnings or panicking, he began to remove them, not emotionally, but procedurally. He believed that removing risk, even human risk, was part of the job. In his world, silence was not just a strategy. It was survival. The FBI later said that Lufthansa didn't fail because it was technically flawed. It failed because it required trust after completion, and trust could not survive greed. One detective famously said, "The robbery itself was perfect. The aftermath wasn't." Burke understood that better than anyone else. That is why he never talked. That is why he never spent money publicly. That is why he lived modestly, even when he had millions hidden across storage facilities, warehouses, walls, and buried in containers. Money was not meant to be displayed. It was meant to be defended. Of the estimated 6 million stolen in the Lufthansa heist, investigators recovered none. Not a single bag, bill, or piece of traceable jewelry. Insurance agencies paid out losses. Lufthansa absorbed cost, but no bank, agency, or government found the money or proved who had it. Money, like names, faded into shadows. Law enforcement never officially closed the case. The Lufthansa file remained active, reviewed occasionally by investigators, kept as a symbolic reminder that even modern crime science could not undo old-fashioned discipline. The New York FBI field office maintained a case file marked with a simple inscription: Lufthansa theft, probably orchestrated, never proven. Movies and books shaped perception, turning the story into entertainment. But behind that, for investigators, it remained something else, the closest they ever came to capturing a ghost. In the criminal world, men sought power through presence. Jimmy Burke taught that real power came through absence. He once said, according to a former associate, if they find you, you weren't good enough to stay hidden. For most criminals, hiding was weakness. For Burke, hiding was design. In the end, the Lufthansa heist became less about the money stolen and more about the system that protected it. A system of silence. A system built not on theatrics, not on violence, but on something far stronger: discipline. That is why decades later, the exact location of the Lufthansa money, the complete list of men involved, and the precise design of the operation all remain unconfirmed. They were never written down. They were never spoken. They simply vanished. Just like the money. Just like the truth. Just like the man. Chapter 15. The Real Jimmy Conway. Myth, Memory, and the Man Behind the Mafia Legend. In the final accounting of organized crime history, certain individuals became icons not because they were the most brutal or the most publicly notorious, but because they existed almost entirely between fact and legend. Jimmy Burke was one of those rare figures. Unlike famous crime bosses whose identities filled headlines, Gotti, Capone, Gigani, Burke was never a household name to the general public. He didn't cultivate attention, didn't perform gangster culture, didn't embrace media. Yet, when Hollywood portrayed him as Jimmy Conway in the film Goodfellas for a generation of viewers, he became something else entirely. Not a ghost, but a cinematic figure. Not a shadow, but a myth. But behind the film, behind the dramatized retellings, behind the pop culture fascination, there remained a stubborn truth. Very little about Jimmy Burke was ever truly known. He left almost no records, no confessions, no recorded interviews, no memoir, not a single detailed explanation of how he rose, how he operated, or even how he planned the Lufthansa heist. His story, what survives of it, was reconstructed through FBI reports, surviving associate testimony, missing persons files, wiretap transcripts, and speculation. He did not write his own legend. Others did. The FBI, despite decades of investigation, never fully proved his role in Lufthansa. The agency publicly referred to him as the likely architect of the heist, yet he was never charged in connection to it. The agency was certain of his involvement, but certainty had never been the same as evidence. He died without a conviction for the crime that defined his reputation. That was not victory. It was structure. It was control. Jimmy Burke built his career on invisibility, not by hiding, but by never standing out. He understood that the strongest criminal operations were not loud, theatrical, or violent without purpose. They were subtle, disciplined, precise, structured. They were not defined by big scores, but by long-term control. He did not care about power in the traditional sense. He did not crave respect, fear, or attention. He craved certainty, quiet, predictable systems. He was not a gangster looking for glory. He was a strategist looking for order. In interviews years later, Henry Hill said that Burke didn't like being called a gangster. He saw himself as a businessman, but not the kind that chased profit for indulgence. He chased profit for control. He once said, "Money don't make you powerful. Money lets you keep from being weak." That philosophy guided him more than anything. He never dressed like a showman. He never spent money publicly. He never flaunted his influence. He didn't have enemies because he didn't seek confrontation. He didn't have a personal kingdom because kingdoms required visibility. Instead, he built systems, quiet, practical, deeply effective. Robert's Lounge was not built to impress. It was built to listen. JFK Airport was not a crime scene. It was a supply chain. The Lufthansa heist was not a stunt. It was logistics. He was not the commander of an army. He was an architect of networks, drivers, clerks, handlers, distributors, earners, and cleaners. The power didn't reside in guns, titles, or ranks. It lived in knowledge. Who could be trusted, who could be paid, who could be used, and who needed to be removed. He was never made man. That fact often surprises those unfamiliar with the structure of American organized crime. He could never be formally inducted into the Mafia. He was Irish. He could work with them. He could earn for them. He could even advise them. But he could never swear the oath. Yet despite that, he held influence in multiple crime families. The Lucchese, Gambino, and Colombo crews, not through lineage or ceremony, but through value. He could make money. He could solve problems. He could remove risk. And in that world, value often outranked blood. He did not preach loyalty. He engineered it. He didn't ask men to protect him. He created systems in which protecting him also protected themselves. He rarely made threats. He didn't need to. He understood that people were not afraid of punishment. They were afraid of uncertainty. In that world, men did not fear dying. They feared disappearing. In his world, people did not ask what happened to those who vanished after making mistakes. They asked something more chilling. Why weren't they remembered? That was Burke's signature. Not violence, but erasure. Not brutality, but removal. Not intimidation, but silence. Law enforcement agents who saw him in person noted consistent observations. He never panicked. He maintained controlled movement. He allowed silence in rooms where other suspects filled the space with their explanations. If police pushed, he did not resist. He did not evade. He simply remained still. He was not a criminal in the typical sense. He was closer to someone observing the system that was observing him. He had spent a lifetime studying people, patterns, logistics, opportunity, fear, and risk. When finally confronted by those forces, he did not panic. He simply accepted that structure had turned against him, just as it had once served him. In New York criminal history, he became a paradox. Feared, but not feared like a mob boss. Powerful, but not powerful like a don. He existed like a ghost, seen only through the traces he left behind. He was never caught in the act, never recorded ordering a killing, never photographed handling stolen goods. But his presence was clear in one way. Whenever things went missing, whenever people went silent, whenever the biggest crime in American history left no footprints, there was always one name whispered quietly behind closed doors. He was never celebrated. He was never exposed. He was never truly understood. He was only suspected. Even after his death, law enforcement continued revisiting his files. He remained a training case for investigators studying organized crime behavior, not because of his violence, but because of his structure, not because he was flamboyant, but because he was invisible. They called him the architect of silence, a nickname never used in his time, yet entirely fitting. Hollywood turned him into a charming figure. But the real Jimmy Burke was not charming. He was controlled. He was precise. He was patient. He was unemotional and nearly always calm. He did not dominate rooms. He studied them. He did not intimidate people. He measured them. He did not threaten people. He removed them. The Lufthansa robbery remained unsolved, not because he escaped justice, but because he built something rare in his world, a correctly designed system, one where silence wasn't enforced. It was understood. It was expected. It was necessary. No confessions. No witnesses. No loose ends. And in that silence, The true measure of his criminal legacy lived, not in what could be proven, but in what could never be proven. He had always believed that power wasn't about being seen. It was about being remembered without needing to be identified. To investigators, to historians, and to the underworld alike, that became the defining truth of Jimmy Burke. He was never the loudest, never the flashiest, never the most feared, but in the shadows of American organized crime, he was perhaps the most disciplined. And discipline, more than fear, more than loyalty, more than greed, was what made him the most dangerous and the most untouchable.